Alexander Spitsutsev was born on March 1, 1970, in Novokuznetsk. He became the second child in the family after his elder sister, Nadezhda. Their father, Nikolai, had a penchant for alcohol and beautiful women and did not conceal his infidelities from his wife, Lyudmila. However, she endured it and only decided to divorce when Alexander turned 15. By that time, the perpetually inebriated head of the family had already significantly marred the lives of my close ones. Lyudmila always vehemently defended her children, especially her son. Towards Alexander, his mother always harbored a special love and compassion. Although he was born on time, he had a deficit in weight and grew up as a sickly child. Hypercare extended to the point where the boy acquired his own bed only at the age of 12, having slept with his mother until then. Alexander Spitsutsev grew up as a solitary child, inclined towards mischief, and became an admirer of Adolf Hitler. The neighbors in the multi-story building on Pinersky Avenue suffered the most from the schoolboy's antics. When Spitsutsev made Adolf Hitler his idol, the walls of the building were adorned with images and laudatory inscriptions praising the fascist dictator. Broken mailboxes, scorched doorbells, and elevator buttons. All of these were also the handiwork of Alexander. By the way, Spitsutsev entered the elevator exclusively for acts of vandalism. For some strange reason, all members of Alexander's family, including himself, ascended to apartment number 357 on the 9th floor only by the stairs. Initially, residents of other apartments tried to complain to Lyudmila about her son, but she categorically rejected any accusations and eventually began to spit on anyone who criticized him. As a result, neighbors began to avoid the peculiar family. Meanwhile, Spitsutsev started stealing newspapers and magazines from the mailboxes he had damaged. Later, he escalated to stealing bicycles left in the entrance. But soon, Alexander was caught. He broke into the school office using a lockpick and stole radio parts. After that, they attempted to send him to the Kimirevskaya school for juvenile offenders. But once again, his mother came to the thief's defense. She managed to convince the school authorities to give her son a chance for reform, and Alexander was allowed to stay in school. By the way, Lyudmila Spitsutseva herself engaged in theft, which cost her the position of a janitor in one of the schools in Novokuznetsk. There, a significant shortage of soap, onions, light bulbs, and brooms was discovered. The next job for the Spitsutsevs was the court, where she managed to get a job as an assistant to a blind lawyer. Her daughter Nadezhda, who worked as a secretary in the court, helped her in this. Now Lyudmila brought home volumes of criminal cases filled with photos of mutilated victims. The contents of the folders greatly intrigued Alexander, and many evenings were spent by the Spitsutsev family studying the details of the murders. This fascinated the young man much more than his school studies, which he barely completed. And afterwards, he didn't enroll anywhere. Initially, Spitsutsev worked as a master repairing small household appliances, and in 1988, he joined the army. However, he did not serve. During the medical examination, it was revealed that the conscript had serious mental health issues. So instead of a military unit, he ended up in the Novokuznetsk psychiatric hospital. But after a brief treatment, he returned home. In 1991, the 21-year-old Spitsutsev met 15-year-old Evgenia Guselnikova. A romance began between them. Alexander even presented himself to her family as a future fiancé, but the wedding never took place. At some point, Spitsutsev started finding fault with the girl over trivial matters, and it all ended with him beating her to the point where she ended up in the hospital with a head injury. Beating the girl, Spitsutsev had no intention of leaving her alone. He came to her room, where he attacked her again with his fists. The new injuries were prevented by the timely intervention of the nurses. After this, Evgenia decided to sever all ties with Alexander and start a new life. However, he had other plans. Through deception, Spitsutsev lured the girl to his home to never let her go again. By that time, his mother and sister had moved to another apartment, allegedly not to interfere with the newlyweds settling into their own life. Spitsutsev sadistically tortured his victim, starving her, beating her, cutting her with a knife, and burning her with a lighter, drowning out her screams with loud music. Neighbors, accustomed to noise from apartment 357, paid no attention. Even the girl's parents didn't immediately reach out to their daughter, thinking she was spending time with her future husband. They reported to the police only a month after Evgenia's disappearance. Soon, the operatives went to Spesitsev and broke down the door to his apartment. The girl was dead. Her tortured body, with no unharmed place left, was placed on the bed by Spesitsev, who slept next to her. Forensic experts determined that the young woman succumbed to sepsis. Meanwhile, declared mentally unsound, Spesitsev vehemently denied any mistreatment or starvation of his fiancée. Moreover, he began asserting that he faithfully cared for Evgenia, who was ailing and refused to eat. Supporting her son's version, Lyudmila was so outraged by the accusations that she even threw stones at one of the windows of the prosecutor's office. Soon, Alexander once again embarked on compulsory treatment, this time in a specialized hospital in the Oriel region. Not long before that, while passing the days in confinement, the maniac inscribed a letter on his arm in memory of his tortured beloved. Yet, Spesitsev still did not lose hope of establishing his personal life. In the hospital, he implanted a metallic bead under the skin of his genital organ. Instead of pleasure, this intimate piercing brought Spesitsev significant problems. Infections and intense pain in the groin ensued. After 3 years of treatment, the man, deemed non-threatening to society, left the psychiatric hospital with severe inflammation. Spesitsev settled with his sister and mother, but showed no inclination towards social adaptation. Instead of seeking employment, he idled away his time at the railway stations of Novokuznetsk, occasionally joining groups of vagrants. The miscreants were pleased with the bottle of port wine that Alexander brought with him. After consuming it, they would sympathize with him. But soon, this pastime grew tiresome for Spesitsev. In late February 1996, he encountered 21-year-old Elena Trinova at the station, who worked as a nanny at a daycare center. The young woman agreed to visit her new acquaintance. According to Spesitsev's own recollections, he told the girl about the problems arising from his intimate piercing, and she allegedly smirked. The quarrel ensued between them, and at some point, Elena cursed Alexander, triggering his violent outburst. "You go to sleep in pain and wake up in pain, and then someone else talks about this disease to your face. I simply detest such people." After cruelly tormenting his victim, the maniac killed and dismembered Trinova. To dispose of the remains, he ordered his mother, who obediently carried them to an empty field and buried them under the cover of night. A month later, Lyudmila Spesitseva once again went to the wasteland with buckets containing parts of the third girl whom the maniac had lured into his apartment. In April of the same year, Spesitsev noticed a group of teenagers loitering aimlessly around the construction site of the city department store. Alexander approached the schoolchildren and offered them a cigarette, then persuaded them to accompany him and participate in the burglary of an apartment. The teenagers believed that Spesitsev was proposing an exciting adventure and followed the new acquaintance. Alexander led the schoolchildren into his abode and, having secured the entrance, commanded them to proceed to the bedroom. As the group entered the room, the maniac produced a knife and systematically dispatched the adolescents one by one. Subsequently, he arranged the bodies in a corner, covered them, and awaited his mother. By this time, she had secured employment as a guardian at a nursery and continued to reside with her daughter in a separate apartment. It was only a week after the mass murder that Spesitsev's son visited, encountering in the corridor the 6 lifeless forms he was destined to dispose of. Later, the maniac claimed that he was unaware of what his mother had done to them. However, by the following morning, nothing in the apartment hinted at the massacre. Presumably, Lyudmila Spesitseva discarded the dismembered bodies into the nearby Abu River. In May 1996, Spesitsev once again engaged in construction work and, not far from there, encountered 4 teenage girls. The maniac enticed them to his home under the pretense of selling soap. Disposing of the bodies of the schoolgirls slain by Spesitsev fell on the mother once again. By then, remnants of the victims became sustenance for the family's pet, a colossal Newfoundland. Whether they consumed human flesh themselves remains unknown. The family vehemently denied any acts of cannibalism. Meanwhile, Spesitsev persisted in his murderous spree. In May 1996, besides the 4 schoolgirls, at least 7 more individuals perished in the sinister apartment. Despite the quite repulsive appearance, the maniac had a knack for gaining the trust of teenagers who, forgetting caution, ventured into his lair. Some of the victims were lured into the apartment by Lyudmila Spesitseva herself. Brothers and sisters who strolled together and felt secure were particularly susceptible to persuasion. Thus, at the hands of the maniac, 11-year-old Olga and 9-year-old Alexander Nusovtsy met their demise. A few days later, 13-year-old Irina and 12-year-old Dmitry Vorobyov suffered the same fate. The constant disappearances of children and young girls in Novokuznetsk did not escape the attention of law enforcement, prompted by the parents of the missing to file complaints. However, the investigators could not immediately trace Spesitsev. Various scenarios were considered. One of them suggested that the missing individuals might have been sent into slavery in Chechnya. Therefore, members of all Caucasian organized groups in Novokuznetsk were scrutinized for involvement in the disappearances. Yet the criminals vehemently denied any culpability. Without direct evidence, the investigation explored other hypotheses. For instance, the vanished could have become victims of black market organ traffickers. In July 1996, the entire city was shocked by horrifying news. On the banks of the Abu River, parts of human bodies were discovered. Decayed heads, hands, legs, torsos, mostly those of children. Analyzing the remains, experts determined that the bodies were dismembered using saws and scissors. There was no doubt among the law enforcement that a maniac was at large in Novokuznetsk. Additional forces, including experienced investigators and operatives, were deployed to assist the city. The military also joined, combing through forested areas, attics, basements, and standing guard in vacant lots. In addition to Alexander Spesitsev, another maniac was suspected. Oleg Rilkov, the Talitsky Ripper, who was killing in a different city during the same period. However, after Rilkov's apprehension, it was discovered that he had not left the Talitsy area. Remarkably, investigators could have almost immediately apprehended Alexander Spesitsev. They began checking all mentally ill citizens registered with specialists. The verification was conducted promptly, but the maniac was not found on the lists of the mentally ill. The moment of his discharge from the Oriol psychiatric facility was not duly documented. Consequently, the return of Spesitsev to Novokuznetsk remained unknown to the personnel of the local dispensary and the constabulary. Otherwise, the investigators, in light of Spesitsev's recovery, should have initiated progress in his criminal case regarding the demise of Evgenia. In the end, the fatal negligence of the physicians resulted in numerous fatalities. Moreover, law enforcement made a grave error. One of the Spesitsev's neighbors complained of a cadaverous odor in the stairwell and the constant resonant music emanating from Alexander's residence. Regrettably, this information was disregarded. No one conducted an inquiry into the maniac, and the Spesitsevs, despite Novokuznetsk being inundated with law enforcement, persisted in luring victims into their lair. From June to the end of August 1996, the maniac disposed of 4 schoolgirls, 2 women, and a 35-year-old man. However, Spesitsev perpetrated his most heinous atrocity against 3 companions: Anastasia Berneva, her contemporary Evgenia Boroshkina, and 15-year-old Olga Galtsova. The schoolgirls had acquainted themselves within the confines of a hospital, where they underwent examinations together and occasionally ventured out for strolls in the city. On September 24, they, as customary, embarked on a promenade and entered a grocery store for water. At the store's exit, they encountered a petite, gray-haired old woman. The pensioner lamented to the girls that she couldn't unlock the door to her apartment and beseeched them for help, promising in return to furnish the schoolgirls with disposable water cups. The friends consented and trailed the stranger. It turned out to be Lyudmila Spesitseva. The pensioner escorted the schoolgirls to her apartment and rang the doorbell, answered by the nearly disoriented figure of Spesitsev, accompanied by his colossal dog. Aghast, the girls acquiesced to the demands of the maniac and entered. Spesitsev, who presented himself to the victims as Andrei, ushered them into the bedroom and ordered them to wait. The schoolgirls implored to be released, with Evgenia crying particularly loudly. When Spesotsev decided to inject a sedative into her vein, Anastasia seized the moment. Approaching from behind, she endeavored to stun the maniac with a bottle blow to the head but missed, hitting his shoulder. Enraged, Spesotsev pounced on the girl and delivered several blows in the region of the heart, slightly lower in the abdominal area, and in the throat. She continued to live, but donning ropes, he strangled her. After the execution of Anastasia, the maniac compelled her friends to dismember the deceased's body and separate the flesh for a soup, which he then forced Olga and Evgenia to consume. The remnants of the skeleton were thrown to the dog. As usual, Lyudmila removed Anastasia's remains from the apartment. The maniac's sister, Nadezhda, was present with him and the victims in the same apartment during this dreadful time, but never came to the aid of the schoolgirls. Spesotsev persisted in tormenting his captives day after day. He was particularly brutal to his wife, whom he violated, tortured with a soldering iron, broke the girl's arms, and fractured her skull several times. The maniac sewed up her wounds with a regular needle and thread. Once, Spesotsev went berserk and brutally struck Borishkina's head against the floor for an extended period. Olya, who tried to save her friend, performed artificial respiration for a whole hour, but Evgenia's injuries were too severe. She succumbed. Olga Galtseva would later recount to investigators that Spesotsev did not touch her friend's body for 3 days. His perverse religiosity manifested itself in this manner. The maniac decided to give the soul of the deceased time to leave the body and kept the window ajar for this purpose. When 3 days had passed, he instructed Olga to dismember the slain friend's body. The maniac aspired to enter all body parts in one location but failed to do so. On October 24, 1996, the constabulary eventually arrived at his abode. Several days prior, one of Spesotsev's neighbors experienced battery malfunctions. The woman sought assistance from the Housing and Communal Services, prompting utility workers to commence a subapartmental survey of the building's denizens. At some point, they reached the Spesotsev's residence on the 9th floor, yet Alexander adamantly refused to grant them entry. He asserted his status as mentally ill and confined by his own mother. The maniac reiterated this legend to the constable who came for an inspection. Consequently, a police squad arrived at the Spesotsev's dwelling, and the door was forcibly breached. The entering law enforcers were stupefied. A cadaverous odor pervaded, and a dreadful disarray prevailed. The maniac stored 82 articles of wardrobe belonging to his victims, including even children's shoes. From those who perished, Spesotsev removed about 40 pieces of jewelry, rings, earrings, and necklaces. All of it was meticulously arranged in a separate receptacle. Additionally, the killer had a predilection for capturing his victims on an old Polaroid before their demise. Semi-conscious Olga, whom Spesotsev had struck in the abdomen with an awl multiple times, was discovered on the floor in one of the rooms by the constabulary. The girl awaited the maniac, believing he would imminently burst in and finish her off. He had promised to do so if the police arrived. The girl was transported to the hospital. She managed to provide testimony, but despite the physician's efforts, she succumbed to peritonitis and lung edema 3 days later. Meanwhile, the constabulary did not apprehend the maniac himself. He had managed to flee up the fire escape to the roof of the multistory building and conceal himself there. When the police departed from his apartment, he left the building. However, a couple of days later, Spesotsev returned to the entrance and was apprehended by the on-duty officer. "I had no other recourse. They denied me treatment, and my immune system is compromised. In the summer, I'd bundle up in a jacket and sweater. Look, all my hands are covered in sores." He tried to justify his proclivity for murder. Soon, Lyudmila also found herself in the hands of the constabulary. The maniac did not conceal that his mother was his active accomplice, although the woman herself disavowed most criminal episodes during in-person lineups and dismissed her son's words as fabrications. During the investigation, Spesotsev confessed to 19 murders committed from February to September 1996. According to some information, he may be responsible for up to 82 victims. This is suggested by the clothing found during searches. Initially, the investigation only managed to establish his involvement in the slaying of Berneva, Borishkina, Galtsova, and the death of the first victim, Elena Tronova. Psychiatrists in Novokuznetsk who examined Alexander deemed him sane. Alexander Spisovtsev awaited the death penalty and even attempted to sell his head for further post-mortem research in exchange for a few packs of cigarettes. However, in 1997, the maniac was sentenced to just 10 years of imprisonment, an astonishingly lenient punishment considering the gravity of his transgressions. The following year marked a new trial against Spisovtsev. Investigators concluded gathering evidence for another 15 murders committed by the maniac. It seemed that the inevitability of capital punishment loomed over him. But before commencing the new legal proceeding, Spisovtsev had to undergo examination, this time by experts from the Serbsky Institute. Following several months of interaction with the maniac, they insisted on his transfer to a psychiatric hospital, where he has resided in the city of Chemyshin, Volgograd Oblast, ever since. The maniac does not limit his everyday life and partakes in nourishment adequately. Even the trimming of his nails on hands and feet is not attended to by Spisovtsev himself. Sanitary workers handle this task. Recognized as a disabled individual of the second degree, he receives a pension amounting to several thousand rubles. Some of Spisovtsev's funds are sent to his mother, and he allocates the rest for chocolates, reserving a portion for a music center. In his leisure, he peruses literary works, composes poetry, and engages in craftsmanship. Alexander crafts decorations and paints. Some of his creations are dispatched to his mother. Ludmila Spisovtseva was sentenced to 13 years of incarceration and emerged from the Marinskaya women's colony in 2009. After her release, she, along with her daughter Nadezhda, departed from Novokuznetsk. Incidentally, in 2013, the women endeavored to return to their apartment on Pioneer Avenue, but the Spisovtsevs encountered vehement resistance from the residents of the building. Eventually, Ludmila and Nadezhda were only able to access their home under the protection of the police, who assisted the women in transporting their belongings. However, they did not stay there for long and vanished in an unknown direction. Their abode remains vacant to this day. Prospective buyers for the apartment are challenging to find, as no one desires to lease a dwelling with a grim history. According to some information, relatives settled in the city of Osiniki, Kemerovo Oblast. Upon learning of this, local residents began petitioning the Osiniki administration, demanding the expulsion of the cannibals from the city. Due to an error, they even harassed a pensioner resembling Ludmila. Curses and threats rained upon the woman, forcing her to repeatedly present her passport to protect herself. As for Spisovtseva herself, who turned 80 in 2019, she consistently writes appeals to various authorities. She holds on to the hope that her son will one day attain freedom and the entire family will reunite. However, this is unlikely to occur anytime soon, even if specialists acknowledge Alexander Spisovtsev as mentally sound and release him from the psychiatric hospital. What awaits him is not freedom, but a prison cell, and this sentence will almost certainly be lifelong.